September 1914. The Battle of the Marne had ended, and the German advance toward Paris was over. But the armies didn't halt. Instead, hundreds of thousands of men turned and began racing north. French, British, and German commanders pushed their troops toward the coast in a chaotic scramble. Each army was desperately trying to swing around the other's exposed flank, hoping to outmaneuver the enemy and finish the fight before winter arrived. But every attempt to break into the open failed. The moment soldiers stepped out to advance across open ground, they walked into a concentrated wall of mechanical firepower that shredded their ranks. Unable to advance and unable to survive on the surface, the remaining soldiers threw down their gear and started digging. They carved shallow, temporary ditches into the dirt, just to shield their bodies from the incoming metal. The Great European War of sweeping maneuvers and cavalry charges ground to a violent halt. A high-speed campaign had suddenly collapsed into a desperate struggle to stay below the grass. As days turned into weeks, the forward marching stopped entirely. Those shallow, temporary survival holes were reinforced, deepened, and linked together into permanent architecture. This map illustrates the terrifying scale of what followed. The localized digging merged into a continuous, unbroken scar stretching all the way from the North Sea coast down to the Swiss border. More than 400 miles of fortified earth. The armies were now physically locked into the continent. There was no way to go around and no way to push through. The trap had closed, cementing the geography of the Western Front. This massive deadlock was the result of a lethal collision. Commanders were still ordering 19th century infantry tactics, but their men were running headfirst into 20th century industrial weaponry. A single weapon, operated by a crew of just a few men, could now fire hundreds of rounds every minute. One strategically placed machine gun could erase entire waves of advancing men before they crossed the field. The explosives raining from the sky were even more devastating. Nearly 70% of all battlefield deaths during the conflict would be caused by artillery shells, tearing the earth apart from miles away. Against this volume of industrialized metal, gathering thousands of infantrymen into a mass charge was no longer a viable maneuver. It was a guaranteed, absolute death sentence. To survive the lethal surface, millions of men moved underground. For the next several years, this subterranean network became their entire world. The earth was constantly weeping. Rain filled the dugouts with freezing, muddy water. Boots never dried, and uniforms stayed soaked for weeks, causing flesh to numb and rot away, a condition known as trench foot that frequently required amputation. The physical misery compounded rapidly. Lice spread through tightly packed ranks, causing constant, maddening itching. Drawn by discarded food scraps and the bodies of fallen soldiers, rats multiplied by the thousands, some growing as large as cats. The environment carried an odor that veterans later said they never forgot. It was a stagnant mixture of rotting sandbags, spent gunpowder, raw human waste, and decomposing bodies trapped in the dirt. Long before a soldier even aimed a rifle at the opposing side, they had to fight an agonizing daily battle simply to survive the horrific conditions of the earth itself. Just beyond the safety of the trench walls lay no man's land. It was a barren strip of broken earth, sometimes just 50 yards wide, entirely choked with flooded shell craters and thick tangles of barbed wire. To cross the gap was virtually impossible. Even raising a head slightly above the sandbags during daylight could invite an instant fatal bullet from a watchful enemy sniper. But while the armies on the ground were sinking into the mud, technology was accelerating at a staggering pace high above them. Pilots initially flew simple observation missions to track enemy movements from the sky. Soon, they began carrying pistols and rifles into the cockpit. Eventually, engineers figured out how to mount machine guns directly to the aircraft frames. While the infantry remained trapped in a static, suffocating nightmare, the limitless open sky became the testing ground for a lethal new form of aerial combat. By December 1914, snow buried the trenches. As the cold set in, millions of freezing men realized the terrible truth. They were not going home for Christmas. The fighting might not end next year, or the next. In response to the deadlock, engineers on both sides furiously raced to develop any tool that could shatter the opposing line. They designed heavier armored vehicles, packed artillery shells with stronger explosives, and synthesized deadly chemical gases. The fast-moving war of the summer was definitively dead. In its place stood history's longest, bloodiest, and most technologically devastating stalemate. But then, on one freezing, bitter December night, the endless rhythm of exploding artillery suddenly fell completely silent. Drifting through the darkness and the cold, unearthly quiet across no man's land, men began to hear voices singing Christmas carols. Slowly, cautiously, soldiers who had spent months trying to butcher one another left their weapons in the mud and began climbing out of their trenches. What unfolded in the cratered snow was the Christmas Truce of 1914, a brief, profound pause where sworn enemies laid down their arms and recognized their shared humanity, right before the war plunged back into the darkness.